Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by John Dorney, my co-presenter from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us. If you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We really do appreciate it, and we are so grateful for the support we get from you, the listeners. On this episode, my co-presenter John Dorney discussed the history of Ukraine and its parallels with Ireland with Ukrainian scholar Nadia Dobrianska.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. It's me, John Dorney, and I'm joined by a very interesting guest today, Nadia Dobrianska. Nadia has a number of strings to her bow. Among them, she's a scholar of Irish history, speaker of the Irish language to a much better extent than your host today. And she's also Ukrainian, and she's resident in Ireland currently for the second time. We'll get into why. But first of all, Nadia, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Really delighted to talk to you.
And lest people don't believe me, tá fáilte rud, Nadia. Show. Okay, so Nadia, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in Irish culture and Irish history?
Right, so I have a degree in Irish Studies from Queen's University Belfast. I graduated in 2020. I was mostly studying Irish history and politics. And I've had this long-standing interest in Irish culture since I think I was a teen. I'm a victim of Irish soft power. I was introduced to Irish traditional music by a tutor of English from the north of England. And when I heard Altans, like Mairead Nuweni singing in Irish, I was completely taken and wanted to learn Irish. Yeah, I was hoping to do a law degree in Dublin after my bachelor's degree in Ukraine, but because of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we couldn't afford it. So kind of put off all my plans to do Irish studies. But then 10 years afterwards, after lawyering in politics in Ukraine, in policy and human rights, I had a breakdown and decided to do something for myself and just went and won a scholarship to do Irish studies. And here I am.
And so your original interest was actually in Irish music and then the Irish language, I think.
Yes. So, yeah, I'm a musician myself. I've been playing piano since I was a kid, like from early days. And I was firstly interested in Irish music and along with that, literature and poetry and Irish dancing and everything you could get. And at the time in 2005, 2006, we had lots of schools of Irish dancing. The river dance were roaring around the world. So that was the story back then. But then later on, as I grew more interested in politics myself, I got more interested in Irish politics too. And I've had this long-standing interest in history overall. I was admitted to the School of History and the School of Law, but I opted for the School of Law for the sake of subsistence in Ukraine. When I came to Belfast to do Irish studies, I very early on saw that history is the subject that I'm most driven to, and I really delved into very deeply and really happy about that.
And tell us something about your studies of Irish history. What areas did you look into?
I'm mostly interested in 20th century Irish history and political history, and my master's subject was on the Troubles, the Northern Troubles during the 1920s, during partition. And I wrote my master's thesis about the politics of the Weaver Street bombing.
And the Weaver Street bombing, for people who are not aware, was an atrocity in Belfast in 1922.
Yeah, so it's known to be a bombing that killed 6 children, but in fact, 4 children were killed, 4 teenage girls in North Belfast, and 2 women who died later of their wounds. Well, it was a very politically significant bombing that was discussed in Westminster Parliament. There was a lot of whataboutery going on between Michael Collins and Winston Churchill and James Craig. Later, it became the epitome of Catholic suffering for the sake of the nationalist propaganda, and it had really strong reverberations later on. But sadly, it's been forgotten for a long while, and this year there was a centenary of the bombing on the 13th of February, and I was delighted to see that more people were searching for information about it. There were more publications about it coming out, so thankfully the memory is catching up.
Yeah, I mean, the northern aspect of the Irish Revolution is one of the real areas I think where progress has been made in recent years in terms of reopening it, because it was neglected for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really sad that the biggest issue discussed in the historiography is whether it was a pogrom or not. Coming from the place that coined the term pogrom, I'm a bit sad that this is the only thing that is kind of worth of discussing. Well, I think that there's so much more, like why would these people even call the murder of Catholics a pogrom? And why would the other side deny it? And yeah, there's a lot in that.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be speaking mostly about Ukraine today, but we must get you back to talk about that, on future occasions. Before we move on and talk more about, Ukraine and parallels between Ireland and Ukraine, which is what I want to really get into today, is you're interested in the Irish language. Like, how difficult was it for a Ukrainian to learn Irish?
It's fine.
I should tell you that Nadia is very down on people who don't learn Irish or who can't be bothered to learn Irish.
Well, no, I mean, as a Ukrainian, I think I'm more or less fluent in 4 languages, and I used to study 3 more. And growing up in Ukraine, you are kind of exposed to Ukrainian and Russian, regardless of which language is your native. Like I'm a monolingual native Ukrainian speaker, and I learned Russian just from the telly and from the streets and from other people. But it's only natural for people to know a few languages. So when I see Irish people giving out that Irish is so hard, I'm more prone to attribute that to them being English speakers, that they don't need to learn other languages to get on in the world, rather than sheer complexity of Irish. But I do agree that the word order and spelling were a bit hard to get used to. But now that I'm used to them, I've had this experience now and again when I'd start writing English with the Irish spelling rules, like quel, lahan, I was like, no, this is wrong, I should stop that. But
You mentioned originally learning Irish from a grammar book, I think in Kiev or something like that.
Yeah, this was so strange, like 10 years ago. Before that, when I was 19, I tried to learn Irish from a textbook in Russian. They do teach Irish at the Moscow University, so I can't get hold of that book anymore. But the problem was with this textbook that it had enormous charts of spelling and pronunciation rules that just, to me as an Irish speaker now, just don't make sense. But back in the day, I thought I was just stupid. Their Irish was so hard and I was just not able to learn it. Yeah, in 2018, I downloaded Duolingo and tried to learn Irish there. And it turned out that Irish is quite easy, once you get used to the word order and spelling, that's it.
Now, we got to talk about how you ended up living in Ireland for the second time. So, I realize it's a difficult time for you, but can you just say briefly how you ended up in Ireland, for the second time?
Yeah, so as you probably know, on 24th of February, Russia started a new invasion in Ukraine, and I'm from Kiev myself. And the first day when I read that the war was declared at 5 a.m. when it was declared, and I just rang my parents, rang my brother, packed my stuff, and heard the bombings in Kiev, and we fled that day. And the week after staying in the countryside with my family, I decided that we go to Ireland, because by that time Ireland waived visa restrictions for Ukrainians. And to me, knowing that nowhere in Ukraine is safe because of Russia's fighter jets and long-range ballistic missiles, I couldn't bear knowing that my elderly parents would be bombed, because they are just not quick enough to hide in bomb shelters. So I was definitely considering leaving Ukraine, becoming refugees, and going to Ireland was only a natural choice, because I had, my most friends were in Northern Ireland, but I thought that going to Ireland would be definitely easier for me, knowing the culture and sort of having this connection, and it worked out really well. So we are settled in Cork, in rural Cork for now, so hopefully moving to Cork City shortly. And yeah, so I'm here with my parents and my cousin and her 4-month-old son, and I'm going to go back to Poland in a few days to pick up my brother's cat, who is a wee refugee cat, because my brother is in territorial defence.
And we're happy to have you, Nadia, here in Ireland. So I want to chat about Ukraine and its history, and not so much in regard to a polemical way or in regard to necessarily explaining what's happening now, but I think Irish people in general don't know that much about Ukraine. So I want to chat about the history of Ukraine and any parallels with Ireland, so that people will have kind of a mental picture of Ukraine and its history. So my first question, Nadia, is the name Ukraine. Where does it come from, and what does it mean?
So it's a bit complicated. The word Ukraine has a root krai in Ukrainian, which has different meanings. And linguistically speaking, the most plausible theory is that krai in Ukraine means a certain territory, which was reserved to old Ukrainian tribes, like Slavic tribes that made Ukraine later. It basically means country, as in tier in Irish, as in land connected to the people. It also has a different meaning. Krai means edge, and there is always this tension between Russia and Russian-speaking, saying that Ukraine means Okraina, as in the outskirts, and this is used as a pretext to declare that Ukraine is not a thing and Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist as a nation because they're just an outskirt to Russia. But linguistically speaking, looking at the history of Ukrainian language, Ukraine means the country and became first used as the name of Ukrainian nation probably only in mid-19th century. It was used maybe around 15th, 16th century to describe the Cossack state. So eventually it became the name of the nation, but the roots remain the same.
Yeah, I'm going to get onto the Cossacks and so on. But, one thing to note, though, is this is not necessarily that unusual. Like, for example, in the Basque Country, they invented a name for the Basque Country again in the 19th century, Euskadi. Before that, they just talked about the place where the Basque language was spoken. So, Ireland has the good luck to be an island, so you had to have some name for it, I suppose. But my other question, though, was what other names have Ukrainians gone by? Because Ukrainians have actually been around a long time. They just necessarily haven't been called Ukrainians. Like in the English language, they used to be called, I believe, Ruthenians. Can you talk about some of the other names for Ukrainians over the centuries?
Yeah, well, Ruthenians were pretty much the other word that was used for Ukrainians. It was connected to the Duchy of Kiev, Kievska Rus in Ukrainian, Kievan Rus, as you would say that in English, the medieval state that existed that was centered in Kiev. And later on, when Kievan Rus was in decay and eventually it was taken over by the Great Duchy of Lithuania and Poland and other states, it kind of persisted well into the 19th century as the word for Ukrainians. You can see it in the chronicles since medieval ages, and well into the 19th century when Ukrainians took over, the word Ukrainians took over. But we also have this, it was used in the interwar Poland that held Western Ukraine, like Galicia and Volhynia, to kind of signify that Ruthenians are different from Ukrainians. That was a very interesting political move. And also in modern Ukraine, there's this group in Transcarpathia and in Western Ukraine who call themselves Ruthenians and claiming that they are a bit of a different ethnic group. And this is a very interesting debate, which is not that strong given the war, but there is the debate about that too. So the word is no longer used to signify all Ukrainians in history. And well, the other term that you would hear about Ukraine is the Little Russia, well, literally translated from Smalorossia. And this is the term that was used by Catherine II, the Empress of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian lands within the Russian Empire were named officially as Malorossia, and you would later see it being used administratively and politically to refer to Ukrainians. And we had this kind of contest that even now we're saying that if there is a person who is prone to, well, sympathetic to Russia politically, sometimes you can hear them called Maloros in this way.
Yeah, there's obvious Irish equivalents for that I won't go into, but Today, a Ukrainian is a citizen of Ukraine. And I think it's important also to emphasize that, Ukraine is a state that voted for independence in 1991 and that has been invaded now. But, we'll get into all of that. But my question, though, is historically, how has a Ukrainian been defined? Is it by language? Is it by, like religion, like it was in Ireland? Or what were the traditional kind of identifiers of a Ukrainian?
Probably speak about this identification as Ukrainian only probably since early modern times, at least. And Ukrainians were Greek Orthodox, and I would say that since Ukrainian territories were conquered by the Great Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish Kingdom, identification of Ukrainians became an important issue for them. Within this Polish-Lithuanian Union, Ukrainians were the Greek Orthodox, while Lithuanians were Catholic. And so back in the day, this sectarian identification was important, and one of the supposedly reasons why the Cossacks were so important for Ukraine, because they were defending the Orthodox faith. That was the trope. But then when Ukraine willingly joined the union with Russian, religion stopped being an issue. And I would say that probably the language became more of an identifier. But it's really hard to say that, well, as in Northern Ireland, like religion is probably a predictor of identity, but political identity, but probably not in all cases. So in Ukraine these days, and well, since the Soviet Union, and in these days, there are many Russian speakers in Ukraine who identify as Ukrainian, and Ukrainian speaking who might not be extremely identifying with Ukraine, maybe not as many of them. Well, since 2014, when the first stage of Russian invasion began, Ukraine developed this rather broad political identity that became inclusive for people of all faiths and of all languages. Provided that they want to be part of this, to be defined as Ukrainian. And it was a big deal in 2014 when Russian-speaking volunteers went to fight for the Ukrainian army, and there was a certain degree of tension that, oh, you speak Russian, how come you think you're Ukrainian? But this is the fact now, and I'm really proud about this inclusive Ukrainian identity that we're seeing now, because up until then, maybe you would rather hear certain degree of ethnic nationalism being more spoken about. It wouldn't be as prevalent, but it was discussed that, oh, you're Ukrainian because you speak Ukrainian, you were born in Ukraine. And these days there are proud Ukrainians who are of Georgian origin and ethnically Russian and Jewish Ukrainians who are considered as Ukrainians.
And Greeks even, I believe, people of Greek heritage.
Of course. Yeah, so the Azov Greeks been living in the Azov region for a long while, since at least end of 18th century into 19th century, when Catherine II invited colonization of southeast Ukraine. It's a long story why it became possible, but we'll hopefully get into that.
Yeah, I'm going to take you right back into the early Middle Ages, and to a kingdom that's known in English anyway as Kievan Rus, which is claimed as the mother or father, I suppose, of both Ukraine and Russia. Can you tell me what Kievan Rus was and what it means?
So the territory of modern Ukraine back then was populated by the Slavic tribes, like Eastern Slavic tribes, and they sort of spoke what Ukrainian linguists consider as Praslovanska mova, as in Proto-Slavic language, which, well, according to the linguists, politically there are different theories about that language, but they around 8th, 9th century, they somehow ended up being ruled by the Vikings, by the Rurik dynasty. And, well, there's this beautiful legend that supposedly Slavic tribes invited them to come and rule over us. That's the legend, but you would probably think that they were conquered. And one of the small things is that Ukraine shares with Ireland in this respect is the borrowings from Old Norse, because that was the only period in time when Ukraine was directly borrowing words from Old Norse. As in, you could see that the word for cod in Irish, trosk, and triska in Ukrainian have the same root. And this is not because Ukrainians had any dealings with the Irish back then, but that's because of the Vikings. So eventually the Vikings really assimilated, and as it always happened, and so Ukrainian prominent dukes of Kiev, the Duchy of Kiev became sort of a cultural center back in the day with vibrant architecture and strong connections with continental Europe.
And if I can just jump in for a second, who was Prince Volodymyr or Vladimir?
Well, there were two of them. One of them, Volodymyr Veliki, Volodymyr the Great, who supposedly baptized Ukraine.
He was the St. Patrick of Ukraine almost, except he was also a king.
Yeah, well, you see, this is the political legend that he was the one who baptized Ukraine with the sword and the glory of making Christianity the official religion. But there's evidence of previous dukes adopting Christianity too. So this is the story that is still, it's cherished now, but historically it's not exactly accurate, and you wouldn't think that Ukraine would be christened in a day. There was lots of stories about the pagans being prosecuted by him. But yeah, he was the one who is the most remembered of the dukes. Well, there's also the Duchess Olga, who was clearly of Viking ancestry. She's very famous in Ukraine for the revenge that she took on the tribe of Drevlyane, who weren't happy to pay rates to her husband, Duke Ihor, and they murdered him. Her revenge on them is very famous, that supposedly she brought them coal with the birds who set fire their Drevlyane's homes on fire, and supposedly she burned the ambassadors of Drevlyane in the sauna. And this image of Duchess Olga is very strong among Ukrainians, as in saying, well, we have strong women too, and this is what happens when you're messing with us.
Kievan Rus, from my reading, was, prosperous medieval state, and it's in touch with the Byzantine Empire, so, what's left of the Eastern Roman Empire and so on. And that's where the Orthodox Christianity comes from. And what brought that period to an end, first of all?
One of the reasons was that there was a lot of infighting among the heirs, among the dukes, and which was ubiquitous in medieval Europe. And the other reason was the Mongol Tatar invasion in the 13th century.
So this is Genghis Khan or his descendants?
Yes. And so the Kievan Rus was conquered by the Mongol Tatars. The center of Ukrainian kind of medieval state moved to the west, to the kingdom, to the Duchy of Galicia and Volhynia. And the Duke Danilo was even crowned by the Pope to become the King Danilo, as he was really asking the rest of Europe to join in to launch a crusade against the Mongols, so to liberate Ukrainian territories. But they sent their deep concern, and he got his crown, but nothing ever happened.
So, after the downfall of Kievan Rus, a state was set up to the east around what's now Moscow, which is, the initially called Muscovy, I think. Is that right?
So these territories, the Slavic territories, had these big different duchies, and Moscow was, I'm not sure when Moscow was founded, but it didn't mean that the center moved. It was rather different duchies came into the Mongol power, and not all of them did.
The reason I bring it up is that people still debate about this today. I mean, even the president of Russia brought this up at various times, saying how, Kievan Rus is the ancestor of Russia and not Ukraine and so on. So, I mean, I suppose the question for us today is, what significance does Kievan Rus have in terms of, popular memory and national memory in Ukraine?
Yeah, Ukraine, Kievan Rus is literally one of the states that existed in the Ukrainian territories, and Ukrainian language, and literally living with the churches and certain buildings that were built back then. So this is the significant part of Ukrainian history and Ukraine present day. So the dukes and of Kievan Rus are part of the popular memory. When there was a competition, there was the show who the greatest Ukrainians are, and Duke Volodymyr was one of the leading ones, even in 2000s, among the Ukrainian public watching telly. So yeah, this is a very strong memory and cultural heritage of the churches and monasteries that were built back then. They're undeniably part of Ukrainian culture, modern Ukrainian cultural heritage and references. Yeah, it's a long story and probably not for our talk today, why Russia cannot live without the heritage of Kiev and Rus being an independent state. But this is their interpretation of history. And I personally don't think that we need to we have to own all the territories that we ever had. Like Ukrainian borders have been changing throughout history so many times. Yeah, I think it's a very imperialist thing to think that if we once owned certain territory, we have to have it on our.
Yeah, I mean, once upon a time, the last High King of Ireland, Rory O'Cahir, pledged allegiance and subservience to the King of England, back in the 12th century. But so what, is the question. Moving on, though, you've alluded to this, and this is probably the most unfamiliar period, I think, to Irish listeners. But for a long time, a lot of what's now Ukraine was ruled by Poland and Lithuania. Can you try to explain that?
First of all, after the Mongol Tatar state fell in decay, the other rulers in Europe were taking advantage of that. So the Duchy of Lithuania was very expansionist back in the 13th, 14th century. And, the Polish kingdom as well, but the Duchy of Lithuania conquered most of modern Ukrainian territories back in 13th, 14th century. And they gradually developed this union between Lithuania and Poland that resulted in this Rzeczpospolita Polska, is the Polish name, which included Ukrainian territories, Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine. And Ukrainians were the third big nation in this union, but they never had the status, because the union developed from the crown, from dynastical unions between the Polish kings and queens and dukes of Lithuania, and Ukrainians were there as their subjects, to put it this way. So Ukrainian nobility didn't have the same privileges as the Polish and Lithuanian nobility. And so this was the period when sectarianism was the last time significant for Ukraine. And during the Reformation, there was this big effort by the Polish rulers to bring end to the orthodoxy among Ukrainians. So they created this Brest Union, Brestejską Ugodę, in 1596, when they tried to merge the Greek Orthodox Church in Ukraine with the Roman Catholic Church. It worked. So some people joined this church. So there's quite significant numbers in modern Ukraine of people who are Greek Orthodox, but they belong ultimately to the Catholic Church. But it didn't end Orthodoxy in Ukraine. And the polemics among Ukrainian scholars back then and politicians really contributed to development of Ukrainian literary language. They were giving out about the union, or giving out, to those who were giving out about it. So it was a very interesting period.
Forgive me for just taking out, the highlights of 1,000 years of Ukrainian history, Nadia, but the Cossacks are a very important part of this period of Ukrainian history. And even today, I think of Ukrainian kind of historical memory. Who were the Cossacks, and why were they important in this period?
Yes, so nobody really knows how they came into being. There are so many theories behind it. But basically, this was the warrior social group in Ukraine that consisted, the most standard way to describe them were as the free men who were out of serfdom, and they were living living freely from the serfdom that was imposed by the state on Ukrainian farmers back then. And they were known for their raids of the Crimean Khanate, and they were always warring with the Turks. And they became the symbols of freedom and love for freedom in the 19th century Ukraine and onwards, as a symbol of Ukrainian statehood. But in fairness, looking back, as doing a bit of a revisionist history, they were basically a class that was not accommodated for in the Rzeczpospolita state, because there were two groups of Cossacks. One were the Zaporizhzhia Sich, the army that lived in central Dnipro, Ukraine. The others were the registry Cossacks, who were on the payroll of king. And there was quite a significant strife of the Cossacks to become recognized by the state. And there were Cossack uprisings early 17th century to increase the number of Cossacks on the state registry. And ultimately, the uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which, while Ireland was ravaged by Cromwell about the same time, the Ukrainian Cossacks were fighting for independence from Poland. They wanted recognition of their privileges in the same scale as the Polish and Lithuanian nobility, and they wouldn't get this, so they fought for this independence.
To put kind of a marker for Irish listeners, is there some comparison between, say, the rebellion of this man whose name I find hard to pronounce,
Khmelnytsky, that's, yeah.
Khmelnytsky, yeah. So is there some comparison between this rebellion in the 1640s and, say, the Great Rebellion in Ireland in 1641? So, like, you know, the Poles maybe taking the place of the English and Scottish landowners in Ireland. Is there some comparison there?
I never thought about this, but now that you mention it, yeah. Well, the thing is that Cossacks didn't care about the ordinary Ukrainians as in Ukrainian farmers. That's the thing why I wouldn't say that Cossacks would be really this. We should be critical about the role in Ukrainian history. So, but the issues of oppression of certain like Orthodox group in the Polish state, you could look at it this way.
Yeah, so there is, you know, it's also part of this period of European history. So there's religious wars, social uprisings, stuff all over Europe in the middle of the 17th century. So, you know, I guess we all just have that in common.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that the history of Cossack uprisings were previously, before Khmelnytsky's uprising, I think that Khmelnytsky was just the one who was more organized and had better talents to organize his rebellion, rather than that he was in any way more different from the previous organizers of uprising. So the uprising started in 1648, and it basically created the first Ukrainian state since the collapse of the Kievan Rus. And Khmelnytsky was really struggling to preserve the state, and this reason he joined, after taking the territories of Ukraine from the Polish rule, he decided to join the union with Russian Tsar in 1654. For this reason, in the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire, he was celebrated as the great unifier of the two peoples, while Ukrainian nationalists throughout history, well, probably not in modern days, but definitely while Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, they really hated him.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking there are some Irish comparisons in the sense that the Irish rebels of the 17th century pledged allegiance to the monarchy of England against the Republic of Cromwell and so on. But history is complicated, I suppose, is the takeaway. But the important thing from our perspective is that it's at this point that most of Ukraine became subject to the Russian Tsars, where some of it, I think, was left under Polish rule.
Western Ukraine and central Ukraine and north of Ukraine became parts of the state. But I have to remind you that south and east of Ukraine were vaguely inhabited. They were called like the wild field because they were like no man's land between Ukraine. Well, I'll use the Ukraine, but referring just to modern day Ukrainian territories. So between Ukraine and the Crimean Khanate, and they were mutual raids when Crimean Tatars would be raiding Ukrainian territories, taking Ukrainians as booty and selling them and slaves, and vice versa. Ukrainian Cossacks would be raiding the Crimean Khanate and taking their people as slaves. So these territories were uninhabited because they were just dangerous. So the part to the north from that, these territories were joined during the union with the Russian Tsar, but in 1654. But then later, it's the 17th century, the Russian Tsar and the Polish state were eventually partitioned Ukraine among them. So the Ukraine was divided into what we call the left bank Ukraine and the right bank left, so along the Dnipro River. And this was undone by partitions of Poland in the 18th century.
Right. So, for listeners who are not familiar, Poland was quite an important early modern kingdom, but at the end of the 18th century, it was totally partitioned between the surrounding powers. So, for our purposes, like Prussia, Russia, and Austria.
Yeah, so that's how most of Ukraine ended up within the Russian Empire. You could call this Big Ukraine, Greater Ukraine, basically all Ukraine except for the Western Galicia and Volyn. And Galicia and Volyn were taken by the Austrian Empire along with Polish territories. This interesting thing that how Ukrainian nationalism was developing in the 19th century, there was a big risk that Western Ukraine would have developed different ethnic identities because they weren't part of the same state formation processes in Balkans, for example, when certain ethnic groups were divided and
Serbs and Croats, for example.
Yeah, I don't want to do any hot takes about that, but given the process when Ukrainians could have ended up becoming two separated identities, it could have happened in the 19th century, but it didn't. There was indeed strong intellectual connection among the Ukrainian intelligentsia in Western Ukraine and in the Greater Ukraine.
One thing to emphasize, I think, which is interesting, and which again Irish listeners might not know, is that Western Ukraine, around Lviv and so on, wasn't under Russian rule until 1939. I think, isn't that right?
Yes, I think even up to 1940.
Or because of the war, really not until 1945, I suppose.
No, they started. They were at repressions of the Western Ukrainians as early as 1940. Unfortunately,
my point was, so Western Ukraine has a different history, which isn't under Russia until the 20th century, and so in the 19th century you have the Austrian province, if you like, of Galicia, right, which is now in Ukraine, and all of the rest of Ukraine by that time under Russian Tsarist rule. Isn't that right?
Yeah. And there were also, the central and northern Ukraine that were inhabited by Ukrainians became part of the Russian Empire, and also southeast of Ukraine became colonized by Ukrainians and Russians, and Russian Empire were inviting people from other states such as Germany, like Mennonites were colonizing it, and Donetsk itself was founded by John Hughes, who's a Welsh industrialist.
That's a very interesting story. And again, a bit closer to home for Irish listeners. So John Hughes, Wales has a very rich coal mining tradition, and he brought this to Donetsk and what's now the east of Ukraine.
Yeah, it's unbelievable now, especially because the colonization, now we're considering that it's colony if it's overseas, if it's far away, and if there's no land border with the metropole, but colonization of continental Europe is the whole thing in itself. These parts of Ukraine were a bit of wild southeast, if you put it, compared to Wild West, but they were indeed, after the Russian Empire crushed won the series of wars with Turkey in 18th century and crushed the Crimean Khanate. Well, basically they annexated Crimea again, for the first time.
First time, yeah. And just to, again, for those who are unfamiliar, the Crimean Khanate was a Muslim kingdom populated by descendants of an Asian people, the Tartars.
Mongol Tatars, yes. Yeah, so, the ending of the mutual raids made the southeast of Ukraine inhabitable. And so many people from Ukraine were moving there. There was this programs of relocation and granting them land, basically granting Ukrainians land. And you will always know that if you see a Ukrainian, he probably wants the land. And the Ukrainians back in the day, they did.
You're in the right country for that mentality.
I know.
But moving on, because like I said, we have 1,000 years of history to cover, and we were doing pretty well because we've done about 500 years in about 20 minutes, which is quite good. But in the 19th century, nationalism becomes a thing. To use modern terminology, everywhere. The modern thinking about that didn't really exist before the 19th century, including in Ireland. So how did Ukrainian nationalism as a modern kind of political idea come about in the 19th century, and what were the kind of key thinkers and ideas there?
Traditionally, Ukrainian historians divide 3 stages of development of the Ukrainian nation in the 19th century. So the first would be the ethnographic interest, when intelligentsia would be going and exploring the ways of the ordinary folk and collecting ethnographic material and folk stories and poetry and songs. And it was pretty much the same around Europe. Later, there was this more of political interest in learning, recording what Ukrainian peasants, of their ways and how they live. And eventually this intelligentsia were developing the ideas of statehood and building political projects behind it. One of the political significant people of the period would be Taras Shevchenko, of course, and Kirill, the Brotherhood of Kirill and Methodius. That was a secret organization by Ukrainian cultural leaders such as Taras Shevchenko himself and Pantelimon Kulish and others. They were dreaming of an Ukrainian state. Taras Shevchenko looks like James Connolly, and he has this beautiful mustache that makes him very recognizable. For Ukraine, when I saw James Connolly, I was like, right, he looks too familiar. So Taras Shevchenko is Ukrainian poet. He's called as Father of Nation, and his book Kobzar, as a collection of poems in Ukrainian, is still deemed as the most influential Ukrainian poet. And he was one of those who were back in the day looking at the Cossack heritage and thinking that we want Ukrainian independent state. And he was sent in exile within Russia. He was deported in prisons, and like many, but he was the strongest figure. Later on, Ukrainian intelligentsia were contemplating Ukrainian independence, and they were quite well connected within European intellectual circles, and they were keeping close eye on the Irish Home Rule movement and thinking if they want to proceed with that too. But ultimately, I would say that Ukrainians within the Russian Empire were more or less, in the Irish terms, home rulers. They didn't really have this strong tradition of secret societies. I'm not quite sure why. There probably should be some research about it. My sense was that they were rather thinking about autonomous Ukraine within the Russian Empire rather than an independent Ukrainian state. And for this reason, one of the reasons why the Ukrainian state projects later in the century didn't survive the wars.
Right. I mean, you mentioned serfdom before, and the idea, I think, of Cossacks as free people as opposed to serfs. It's as a 19th century idea. I mean, what was the relationship between the national and the social question, in Irish terms, like freeing the serfs versus freeing Ukraine in very simple terms?
Yeah, so when Ukraine joined union with the Russian Tsar and became part of the Russian Empire, we had this second wave of serfdom, which in Europe had been waning away, but in the Russian Empire it was really strong. It was cancelled only in 1861, but way up into the 20th century the serfs had to pay for their freedom, and hardly anyone could afford it, if you know what I mean. So the serfdom was still real. And Taras Shevchenko's literature and basically all nationalist literature of 19th century Ukraine was all about the suffering, the plight of Ukrainian peasants in the serfdom. And in this way, Ukrainians were no different from the Russians within the Russian Empire or any other nations within the Russian Empire. But indeed, this fight for personal freedom was part of the fight for national freedom.
Most of the peasants, for want of a better word, would have also been Ukrainian as well, though, right? Or most of the serfs in that part of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, so Ukrainians were a very, very agricultural nation back then, because the nobility and the people in the cities were mostly Russian or Polish, and Ukrainians were the overwhelming peasant majority. There was Ukrainian intelligentsia, as in teachers and certain intellectuals. So there were also Ukrainian industrialists, but there weren't that many. In this way, why later in the 20th century, communism didn't really appeal to Ukrainian people, even though this is something you probably wouldn't know. This is just, you see, he was part of the Soviet Union, so they were all communists. No. So there was no base for real socialism in Ukraine, because there was not that many workers who would buy into this idea. So probably there would be beetroot factories, like sugar factories and textile factories, and also the heavy industry in Donbas region. Probably they would be the most having workers. But overall, Ukraine was indeed a very rural farming country.
Now, one of the strongest parallels, just in terms of chronology, I suppose, is the First World War finished a lot of empires in Europe. It finished the British Empire and most of Ireland. It finished the Russian Empire, of course, which fell to revolution in 1917. And following that, there's a period, which is known to history as the Russian Civil War, but it also involved kind of revolution and what Ukrainians now call, I believe, the First War of Independence. Can you briefly tell us what happened there and how the collapse of imperial power didn't result in an independent Ukraine in Russian-ruled Ukraine?
So one of the big differences between Ireland and Ukraine in the First World War was that the Russian Empire was conscripting people to fight. And that's why the war was hugely unpopular. So my own great-grandfather fought in the green fields of France in the Russian unit that was shipped all over across the oceans to France from the Russian Empire.
Yeah, you said this to me. Sorry to jump in, Nadia, but you said this to me before that Russian units fought in France. I'd never known that, but yeah, your grandfather ended up in France.
Yeah, my great grandfather. Yeah, we have pictures in my family. Well, we have family album, which is now hopefully not gone in Kiev. There was no pride in serving in the Russian Imperial Army, and so the moods in the Russian Empire were very about the war, about fighting, and about wars overall were really, really, people were opposed to them. So that's why the socialism was strong in this way. So Ukrainian politicians of the time were all socialists, and they were all anti-war, and it played well into their autonomist ideas, home rule, if you like, ideas about a reformed Russian Empire. So when in 1917, eventually, the February Revolution took place and the provisional government was installed in the Russian Empire, and the royal family were removed from power. Ukraine declared Ukrainian People's Republic, which was part of this Russian imperial formation still, but they were really installing the Ukrainian government in many respects. But the reason why I'm saying this, they didn't really have the army quite late into 1917, and this was one of the reasons why Ukrainian state projects of the time didn't survive, because the war was hugely unpopular. And on the other hand, there was this big Bolshevik movement in Russia, and they were building this Red Army that took over power in November 1917, which is coincidentally called an October Revolution, just because of the change of the calendar. Ukrainian People's Republic declared independence only in February 1918, when the Bolsheviks were crushing Kiev.
The Bolsheviks occupied Kiev, and then the Ukrainians declared independence.
Precisely. You'd think that they would have seen this through, but now that you're looking at how Russians are invading Ukraine these days, and everybody's like taken as a surprise, you probably think the Ukrainian back then just wouldn't see this coming. And they were hoping that they would just declare independence and everybody would be happy about that.
But the First World War was not over yet.
No, it wasn't. So this Ukrainian People's Republic was not only ravaged by the Bolsheviks. They were in 1918, and in April, the Germans invaded Ukraine. Like they managed to install their puppet ruler of Ukraine, who was called Hetman, as in the Cossack leader, Skoropadsky, and he was basically representative of the big industrialists and big farmers in Ukraine, and wasn't that popular. But because of the German power, he stayed. Then in 1919, Ukrainian People's Republic won over them. Well, because of World War I ending, they managed
the Germans just left.
Control.
They were obliged to leave by the terms of the armistice.
Precisely. So Ukrainian People's Republic, as in the shape of a directoria, they retook the territories, and then this was a never-ending war between Ukrainian formations and the Bolsheviks and the White Army, and on the other hand, we Polish state forces fighting for the same Ukrainian territories. And when we say Ukrainian People's Republic, I don't mean all territory of Ukraine, because there was lots of other actors, as in Nestor Makhno, who was an anarchist leader, and there were also all sorts of no names in this time, but the local leaders in the day, well, basically men with guns, were sort of ruling the times.
The novelist Bulgakov, I think, said that Kiev changed hands 19 times.
Never thought of it this way, but yeah. Well, eventually, with early 20s, all the Ukrainian state formations lost their power and were taken over either by Poland or by the future Soviet Union, by the Bolshevik Russia. And that's how Ukraine again ended up partitioned again. And there's this big shame among Ukrainian political thought of these days that, we lost strife for independence back in the day. Why would we be infighting amongst each other? Why wouldn't we just stay strong? Well, I personally think that this is only normal, like when you have different political strands and political thoughts, and no nation is a monolith. And especially given the political circumstances back in the day, if Ukrainian political thought was so peaceful and so wishful that their independence would be welcomed, their sort of the way that they are anti-war, this would somehow help them, save them. Well, it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, that brings us on, to, I guess, the ancestor of modern political history in Ukraine. But, the Bolsheviks won the civil war in the Russian Empire. They basically reclaimed all the territory, I think, of the Russian Empire, with a few exceptions. But they instituted what they called, their national policy. And how did this affect Ukraine in the 1920s?
Yeah, so the Bolsheviks very quickly realized that there was no political base for communism, Bolshevism, and socialism in Ukraine, as I said, because this was a very rural economy, and farmers wanted their land. They didn't want anything about the workers, if you know what I mean. And communism kind of presupposes the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Ukrainians were just alien to this. Like my mother told me the memories of my great-grandmother, who was the farming background. They would have the Ukrainian nationalists coming in during this war of independence to them and saying, we want this big Ukraine, and we want this independent Ukraine. And the great-grandmother was just, just not interested. Yeah. They were interested in having their land. That's it. No, all this political stuff is just irrelevant. So what happened in the 20s is that the Soviet Union declared this policy of indigenization expansion, korenizatsiya in Ukrainian. And this was the policy around the world, the Soviet Union. They were sort of allowing local nationalists basically roam free. So Ukraine ended up having a national revival back then with brilliant Ukrainian writers and scholars and historians and economists and Ukrainian schooling in Ukrainian. And eventually, after Lenin died, Stalin took over, and eventually he wasn't exactly happy with all this nationalism that was in bloom. And since the end of 1920s, they pursued the policy to the opposite, to crush all this nationalism they have basically fostered, and to turn and to impose, well, basically the Russian national project, which they wouldn't really admit, but this is what you could see if Ukrainian-speaking writers are being driven to suicide or prosecuted, and Ukrainian schooling was banned, and so all sorts of things. And so the purges of the 1930s followed, that crushed basically the backbone of Ukrainian political life, and also the famine of the 1932-33.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that, and so in Ukraine, it's known as the Holodomor. Can you explain, first of all, what does the term mean? But secondly, what were the kind of contours of this great tragedy in 1932-33?
Right, so Holodomor means, well, more, it sounds a bit similar to Gortamor in Irish for the Great Famine. So more in this situation, in this case, means mass death because of disease, and the holod signifies the actual disease that was the cause. So mass death because of hunger doesn't mean the famine, means the mass death. So since the end of 1920s, the Soviet Union pursued this policy of collectivization, when the land that the farmers got because of the revolution was taken from them to be part of the collective farms that would be owned by the state. And of course, Ukrainians resisted it. Like the Russians were basically, well, when I say Russians, because this was directed from Moscow, of course, there were Ukrainian members of the establishment who were Ukrainian. You would certainly know, you would see that these were the Ukrainian poor who were driving this policy on the ground.
Soviets might be a better term than Russians, I suppose.
I don't know. Soviets is not even a term to me. To me, Soviets is just a period of time. It's not. It doesn't really identify anything. So the land and the stock were taken from the people and their houses if they were owning in excess. And this was the period of when big farmers were stripped of their property. They were left to die. Children would die in the street. So the big farmers, kurkuli in Ukrainian.
Kulaks, I think, is the English.
Russian, it was in Russia. It was kulak in Russia. Kurkul in Ukrainian. My own maternal grandmother, her family, they weren't that rich, but they were like reasonably big farmers, and some of their estate was taken from them. But then the stories from my mother's village were that when the stock was taken from the villagers, their women went back to the collective farm and said, "We're taking our cows," and they took the cows and just went off. Nobody could do anything to them. So, this was a big political process, and it wasn't even all throughout Ukraine. What was happening was that the Ukrainian farmers started uprising, lots and lots and lots of them. So eventually this became the pretext for what the state started to crush this resistance. And in 1932, supposedly there were plans to provide certain amounts of harvest produced by the farmers so that they would submit it, providing it to the state. And supposedly the official line was that the farmers were sabotaging this and they wouldn't be giving the crop. So that's why this policy had to be implemented. But in fact, all food was requisitioned from Ukrainian.
It's difficult if it's your own history, to be honest, to talk about this dispassionately, I suppose. But, scholars debate whether this is an attempt to crush the Ukrainian nation, or also, the Kazakh nation, for example, over in the east, or whether it's part of, communist ideology, or whether it's both, what would you think about that?
Well, my only argument to this is that coincidentally, all this process was restricted to the territory of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were prevented from leaving the territories, from fleeing from hunger, from the famine along the border. So you'd think that if this was some sort of policy that would have been ubiquitous around Russia, but it wasn't. About the same time, only Kazakhstan had a famine, because they were nomads that Russians tried to crush and turn them into settled people, and it also led to mass starvation for different reasons than Ukrainians. So yeah, I'm very skeptical about other ways of interpreting it, and there's a lot of documentary evidence that this was the party line. And yeah, I can't remember the name of the book. There was this comparison of the famine in Ukraine and in Ireland, and there was fantastic essay about the Polish intelligence about Holodomor, and that nobody could believe them, that this was true. About 4 million Ukrainians starved to death.
I mean, like I said, it's impossible to ask someone to be dispassionate about this, about their own history. I mean, but in terms of memory, is there a parallel between the way the Great Famine in Ireland is remembered and the way the Holodomor is remembered in Ukraine?
What I've studied about the Irish memory, I wrote an essay during my master's about it, about the folklore, the memories of the Great Famine in Ireland in the folklore collection. And I was thinking that indeed there are so many parallels in Ukrainian memories, as in nobody died in my family. I swear to God, nobody died in my family. That's what I know. I can't believe it now, having studied the critical views and the Irish memories of the famine. This cannot be true, that everybody's saying that nobody died in their family, for example. So it must be the silences or the distortions or the shame that is behind it.
Yeah, Cormac O'Grada wrote a lot about this in the Irish context, about how villagers would always say it wasn't so bad here, it was worse in the next village. It's some sort of psychological self-defense thing, I think.
Yeah, I was doing my readings for the essay and I was reading Cormac's work too, and it was like, this is like in my mother's village, the famine wasn't that bad. That's literally the memory. But then on the other hand, on my father's side, his maternal, so his mother lived, my mother's parents, well, they weren't born during the famine, but my father's mother survived the Great Famine, the famine after the World War II, and the purges, and now she had to flee Donetsk from the Russian invasion these days. So she's seen it all. And so we have the story about her mother taking my grandmother to the market and leaving her there on a corner in hope that a more well-off family will take her in. But she came back. She couldn't just leave her daughter, who was, I think she was 5 or so. So she tried this, and then she came back to her, and this memory persists, that she would think how desperate a mother should be to give away her daughter when it wasn't exactly the safest thing to do to a 5-year-old child.
Yeah, I mean, that shows how desperate times must have been, really. Moving on from the, unbelievable horrors of the 1930s, and we also have the Great Purges, the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, but to another catastrophic event, which is the Second World War. Historian Timothy Snyder wrote in his book Bloodlands that the two places that suffered most were Belarus and Ukraine in terms of territory in this period. Western Ukraine was part of Poland. The Ukrainians, I understand, didn't get on great there in the interwar period. So now Western Ukraine was part of Poland that was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1940. It's part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Germans. But then all of what's now Ukraine was invaded by Nazi Germany in 1941. A lot of the Holocaust happened in Ukraine, and it was seen as some of the worst fighting in the Second World War. And this period, Nadia, I won't ask you to summarize it all, but basically, in terms of the ideas of, fascism and collaboration versus Ukrainian nationalism and so on, how does this period still reverberate? How is it still used by various people, or how is it remembered by various people today?
It's a huge question, but I'll try to answer. We are aware that Ukrainians barely survived Holodomor and mass purges by the beginning of the World War II. So you'd think that the popular resistance to the Soviet rule was real in the greater Ukraine was crushed. But then there was strong resistance in Western Ukraine that was exemplified by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, was the political wing, and the pretty much terrorist organization back then was led by it consisted of Ukrainians in Ukraine, Western Ukraine, and also in emigration, who were coordinating their subversive activity. And they weren't that active, but still they were carrying out certain targeted assassinations of Polish politicians. And when Germany invaded, Ukrainian nationalists split into what you would call now Banderivtsi and Melnikivtsi, and we're probably more aware of Stepan Bandera, who became the leader of the more active wing, who were eager to fight to collaborate with Germany, thinking that Germans will grant Ukraine independence, and certain numbers of Ukrainian nationalists joined the SS. There were 2 divisions, SS Halichina and SS Nachtigall, who were literally in the parts of the German army. Also, there was a wing of Melnikivtsi who were opposed to active service and were rather looking forward to keep the head low and see how the invasion goes, and later on start their subversive activity. There was horrendous infighting, and the Melnikivtsi apparently may have been leaking information about Banderivtsi to the Germans. So as you imagine, the sort of parts that fighting for independence, they are prone to splits and prone to very bloody infighting, as you know from the history of the IRA. So that was what was going on. And then in 1942, the Ukrainian insurgent army, Ukraińska Powstańska Armia, as in UPA, came into being, which was an amalgamation of this own and other forces. And basically they were fighting the Soviet invaders, the Nazis, and Polish forces. And Polish forces were represented by Armia Krajowa, a nationalist force, and also Armia Ludowa, basically the socialist force.
Now, I got to say to you, Nadia, sorry, I got to jump in though. I mean, Stepan Bandera is today, he's still referenced, and he's a hero to some Ukrainians. But you mentioned to me that, you don't think he's a figure worthy of great admiration.
Well, he is one of the leaders of a nationalist organization fighting for Ukrainian freedom. And in this way, he's the go-to figure for modern day Ukrainian far right. Because during the Soviet times, all Ukrainian nationalism was demonized. And if you have an ethnic, a certain identity other than the Russian identity or this branded like unionist, like Soviet identity, you are very bad, like a monster nationalist. So since independence, there was this movement about the Ukrainian nationalists, like as in far right nationalists, that Stepan Bandera should be glorified and taken as a national leader and hero of Ukraine. And there was this debates about him being awarded a hero. So there's this lot of this politics behind it. But historically speaking, he was doing what he's doing, and UPA that he was part of and own they were doing all sorts of things, and there's no need to say that Ukraine should worship them for what they did. We should acknowledge all sides. Like, for example, like nationalist historiography are really looking to whitewash the crimes that they committed. I mean, imagine like 1944, there was huge ethnic conflict in Volyn in the northwest of Ukraine, where UPA were killing the Poles, ethnically cleansing the Poles, and the Poles, like Armia Krajowa, were ethnically cleansing Ukrainians. And this was on a massive scale, like maybe around 20,000 Ukrainians and Poles, as a modest estimation, died at that time. So these were gruesome times. And
to what extent were Ukrainian nationalists involved in the Holocaust of the Jews at the time?
There were definitely certain Ukrainian forces collaborating with the Germans in execution of Jews. I can't say how many off the top of my head, but this was also a fact as well. There were trials, post-World War trials in the Soviet Union on collaborationists for committing war crimes. And from the research I did for the collaboration legislation in Ukraine, which all of a sudden is very relevant, apparently these trials on the collaborationists in the world after World War II were reasonably fair, and certainly some Ukrainians were tried for that.
I mean, and the Ukrainian nationalists, though, it's an interesting story because there is a significant insurgency in West Ukraine, even after the Second World War, against renewed Soviet rule.
It lasted well into 1950s. It was restricted to the Western Ukraine and especially Carpathian regions, like the mountains, where the Soviets had no prevalence and had no military strength. Yeah, think of it as a long-lasting insurgency. Probably it wasn't all that glorious great men with rifles. You would think that they would also be policing their communities, and these that the UPA committed against Ukrainian women, like gendered violence, who were branded as spies. But the thing is that because the insurgency was so long lasting, the Banderivtsi, the UPA became the bogeyman for the Russians. Yeah, we're still branded as Banderivtsi. So these days, even the Russian invaders right now, the occupants coming into Ukraine at the moment, you have recordings of how they're threatening Ukrainian children and women and civilians saying, "Oh, you're Banderivtsi." Being Ukrainian, I can laugh at it, if you know what I mean. This is that the monster of Bandera and Banderivtsi from World War II is still scaring the Russians. This is, to me, it's just... Yeah, it's very funny.
Though it strikes me, and this is as an outsider in a Western European, from a different political culture in some ways, this word fascist in the Soviet Union, it seems to me, has a much more broad meaning than it really should have. So the fascist means the enemy rather than, a specific political philosophy, it seems to me. The Soviet Union is anti-fascist, and yet the Soviet Union is itself a totalitarian state, So can you help us kind of work the meaning of this word fascist is in the Soviet Union and Soviet discourse, in the late 20th century?
To some extent, I'm really puzzled by this myself. My only answer to this is that the Soviet Union had to build their identity after World War II on this victorious notion that they are the victors of the evil. And why exactly they picked fascism rather than Nazism, I'm not quite sure myself, but the fascist became the bogeyman. And they're still using it for domestic consumption, when before 2013, Russians were sort of playing against Ukraine, aligning with the EU. I would really notice this in the news, that the Ukrainian fascists were like fascist Europe. And this is a very strange phenomenon that probably, it merits like many books.
I mean, this is the thing. So, I mean, there are fascists in the world, and it is an ideology, you know, extreme nationalism and hatred of people and you know, hatred of anyone who's outside your group and so on like this. But that's not the way it's always used in Russia, though. It has a much broader meaning. I'm not sure if you could describe Bandera as a fascist or not. He's certainly like a, you know, far-right nationalist. But I mean, so fascists existed. On the other hand, that's not necessarily what the Soviet Union or Russia means when they use that word.
Yeah. It's like the historical fascism, Mussolini's fascism is definitely not what they're meaning. They were using the fascist invaders, meaning Germans.
Yeah.
Even though we know that the Germans were Nazis. So
I mean, that's to do with the communist ideology of the time, you know, fascism as the last stage of capitalism and so on like that, I suppose. But
yeah, probably you're right. I haven't heard that. Yeah.
You know, that's the way Western communists talked about it anyway. So, Nadia, before we leave World War II, you know, as against the narrative that the Ukrainians were in some way special collaborators, the president of Ukraine, the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has noted that his family, for example, who were, of course, Jewish, fought in the Red Army, you know, all the way to Berlin, in his words. So that's part of the Ukrainian story of World War II as well.
It is. I mean, of course, they had no choice but to be conscripted to the army. And like my family thankfully survived the war because my grandparents were too young to serve in the army. My great-grandparents were a bit too old to serve in the army. Yeah, like my grandfather and his father were interned by the Germans, and like the family memory was that they were held in concentration camp. Well, the truth is that it was an internment camp, and they luckily escaped. So there was this centralized, what is called partisans, like the coordinated insurgency by Moscow and the local, fighting the Germans in the rear, and also there were Ukrainians serving in the Red Army that were taking Berlin and ravaging Germany in the aftermath of World War II. So yeah, there's also this part of the story that sure Ukrainians were victimized in World War II, like one of the peoples who were part of the victorious Red Army, but they were also perpetrators of horrific ravaging in the aftermath. There were also Ukrainians taken as Ostarbeiters to Germany. Like my great aunt would have been taken, but my great grandfather swapped her for himself. Because you imagine like a teenage girl being taken to Germany, like God knows where she would have ended. And he was just working in the family and supposedly sending back home, so it wasn't too bad for him. So yeah, all sorts of stories and reprisals for the Red Army insurgency by the Germans that were taking place. But definitely not one single narrative there, and not one single side that Ukrainians were on.
Yeah, absolutely. In the aftermath of World War II, though, one of the things that Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, of course, did was he moved the Soviet Union westward, which included annexing a whole load of Poland, the Polish state, which was also historically West Ukraine, as well as, you know, the Polish state. So, and also then in the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, added Crimea to the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. So, but the current contours of Ukrainian state kind of emerged in this post-war period, right?
Exactly, yeah. So parts of Romania were taken into the modern Ukraine, where ethnically Ukrainians were living, and parts of Poland. And there was this Operation Wisla, or in English you probably say Operation Wistula, when there was this population swap. So Ukrainians were deported from Poland, from the territories that were not included in the new Soviet borders. And yeah, there's this big longing of Ukrainians from that, like Lemkivshchina, like this region, and others who have lost their homes, but they still know that their generations used to live there. Yeah, and the Crimea was added to the territory of Ukraine as well. The problem with Crimea, that was and remains that scarcity of fresh water there. So logistically, it made more sense for Ukrainian Soviet Republic to mind the Crimea in the reconstruction after the war, because the water was flowing in through the channel from Dnipro River. So that was one of the major rationales for Khrushchev to do this. But of stories that the Russians, for many reasons, for them, Crimea seems like their sacred land. And the fact that Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine gave rise to stories that he was drunk when he signed off that decree. Apparently, this is not valid and Crimea should have been given back to Russia after the independence. But yeah, in fairness, it was an official decision by the USSR.
And Khrushchev was born in Ukraine, but not ethnically Ukrainian. Have I got that right?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, if he was born in Ukraine, he apparently counts as a Ukrainian, but in the narratives, you wouldn't hear like saying, oh, he was a famous Ukrainian, he was leader of the Soviet Union. So there was this construction, well, this identity that was forged, like that was devoid of nationalism, this Soviet like unionist identity, like, well, basically would think that this was some sort of an imperial identity. Ethnic origins or other identities don't matter. And yeah, my take would be that he probably was one of those people who was a proud Soviet man rather than a Ukrainian.
But I mean, I guess he didn't transfer Crimea to Ukrainian Socialist Republic out of Ukrainian patriotism, though.
No, because it's a liability. Crimea is something that requires, well, it's a cost to maintain rather than an asset that you're profiteering from. You know, maintenance of water supplies is not an easy thing to maintain. Well, that's the reason why the Russians, after occupation of the Crimea in 2014, are really struggling.
Well, that's one of the grievances, isn't it, that they can't get the water supply?
Exactly. Well, that's one of the things, humanitarian things that Ukraine had to decide whether they supply the water for the sake of our people there, or they make Russian life easy, or just say, well, our land was taken, so just do what you like about it.
Just on a slight tangent, but just for Irish listeners again, of course, the Crimea features in Irish history because of Irish soldiers who served there in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. But I guess that's kind of a tangent to our story. There's various songs and all about Irish soldiers who served there, you know.
Yeah, but, well, I've lived in Belfast for a year and a half, and when you look at the geography, so that when you look at Kieran Carson's Belfast Confetti, I mean, it's a poem about the Troubles. But when you look at the street names, all of a sudden, it's like, I know this labyrinth so well, Balaclava, Raglan, Inkerman, Odessa Street. Why can't I escape? Every move is punctuated. Crimea Street, dead end again. And some of these streets are still there.
There's a Sebastopol Street in Belfast, isn't there? And these, for people not aware, are all battlefield sites from the Crimean War in the 1850s.
Alma Street as well. And it was so striking when I was in class, prepping for the class, looking at these poems, like, well, why exactly are all these Ukrainian place names featuring in one of the key poems about the Troubles? Well, that's really the reason why. Well, for the record, there's also a Lemberg Street off Donegal Road in Belfast. I used to live nearby, which was very surreal to walk in. Lemberg is the old name, the German name for Lviv in western Ukraine. Yeah, I don't know the story behind it, but it was.
Interesting. I mean, I guess moving on though towards, the end of the Soviet period, I think the late Soviet period is the one that's most difficult for people from the West to kind of visualize. It's quite a different political culture from anything familiar, I think, to us. In terms of Ukraine in the late Soviet period, so from, say, Brezhnev until the end of the Soviet Union, was Ukraine perceived as a restive, suppressed nationality, or did Ukrainian identity start to fade under, Soviet rule and education system and things like that?
Resistance in Ukraine was growing, and there was this strong dissident movement since 1970s. And Ukrainian intelligentsia would be imprisoned. So the dissent was growing, absolutely. And even though there were bans on teaching Ukrainian at schools and added payments to teachers teaching in Russian since the 1980s, Ukrainian identity and language didn't wane to a meaningful extent. So in the 80s, when Gorbachev declared glasnost, especially on the backdrop of the Chernobyl disaster, there was this upsurge of cultural and ecological movements that was basically hidden, like very mild Ukrainian nationalism reviving politically, because for the first time in decades, there was space for certain dissent. There were protests and there were cultural groups, like my father used to take part in one in Spatchina, as in Heritage in Kiev, and the popular movement Narodny Ruch was emerging across Ukraine. So they were protesting on the backdrop of the Chernobyl catastrophe. And eventually this emerged as a strong political movement that led to independence of Ukraine after the referendum, by putting an end to the Soviet Union, basically.
Just to sketch out the chronology for our listeners. So in 1991, there were referendums in the various republics of the Soviet Union, whether they wanted to continue with a new federation or whether they wanted to be independent. Now, the interesting thing, I think, from my perspective, is that in theory, in the Soviet Union, this had always been the right, but it was not actually possible under the Soviet Union for most of the time. How did it come to be that like a referendum on independence was granted to the various republics?
Yeah, so this was definitely a possibility, but nobody would ever lie it. This would be a sort of dissent, you know what I mean? That this was not a thing, the Soviet government.
Yeah, the funniest thing, sorry to interrupt, Nadia. I mean, the funniest thing for me, the weirdest thing about the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union had a constitution which was in theory totally democratic and where everything was elected from the factory up to the republic. And yet the reality was obviously something very different. So, it's something that's quite hard to understand.
I know. This is something that we can see traces of it in Ukrainian legal system now. I, as a lawyer, was really suffering about that when as a young graduate, I went to practice and I realized that the real practice is nothing compared to the actual law. And you could frame it in the way of lack of rule of law, but there's also this big legal culture behind it. And I think it takes generations to change, if you know what I mean.
Sure. But going back to 91 though, so how did it come to be a referendum in Ukraine and the other republics as well?
So the first referendum was early on in 91, and the majority of people voted, we need a reformed Soviet Union. If I'm not mistaken, like more than 70% voters were in favor of a reformed Soviet Union rather than independence. And then later in August 91, Ukraine declared independence on the backdrop of the talks between the leaders of the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Soviet republics. So eventually Ukraine just declared independence, and it was affirmed on the 1st of December by another referendum where the same amount, like more than 70%, voted in favor of independence. And you see that the value of referendums in a totalitarian state is very much overrated, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've read that, but I find it hard to understand them. I mean, so how can you go from a majority saying we want to stay in the Soviet Union to a huge majority now saying we want to leave the Soviet Union? I don't understand how to interpret that, really.
Well, the thing is that there is no free elections, no free referendum, if you know what I mean. So however you vote, people were afraid that their views would affect them. When they were asked, would you like to stay in the Soviet Union in the first half of 1991, I would interpret this as they were afraid if they said we are up for independence, that they would be prosecuted. That's as simple as that. And when they saw that by December that the Soviet Union collapsed, that it was safe to vote in favor of independence, then they could do it. I had a teacher at school who was proudly against this referendum, and she was telling me this in 2004, and I was thinking this was so interesting that she stayed in this country even though she was opposed to independence.
So the Ukraine that became independent in 1991, how to put this, was it like a reborn Ukrainian nation, or was it like a Soviet successor state, just continuing on like before?
I would probably compare this to Ireland after independence. You just don't reinvent the state straight away. You are keeping the institutions, and they change over time with the decisions or with certain upheavals. So Ukraine, to a large extent, after independence, was pretty much the same, and the political structures were the same, and the political actors were basically the same political party functionaries. There was this popular movement, like a new party. The dissidents were released from the labor camps and from prisons after independence, and they were very eager, queuing up to run in elections. But it wasn't that strong. In the first election, returned the president, Leonid Kravchuk, who was the Soviet Communist Party leader, and there was nothing exciting about that. And his opponent, Vyacheslav Chernovil, the leader of the popular movement, he died in a car crash, and there were these rumors that he was assassinated rather than it was an accident, because he would have been if he had won, we would have different political direction emerging in Ukraine. But yeah, who knows?
Like in terms of former Eastern Bloc countries, on one side of Ukraine, there's Poland. Poland has become something quite different from, communist Poland, in the sense of, you have democratic elections, not always particularly pleasant people elected, but free elections. They've joined the European Union. In the economic side, it's very much been privatized in Poland. On the other side of Ukraine is, of course, Russia. And after a kind of a chaotic period in the 1990s, I mean, Russia in some ways reverted back to a very authoritarian system, under the current president. I mean, is Ukraine's experience kind of a mixture of the two of them? Or, how would you describe it since independence?
Well, I would describe Ukrainian political structure as competitive oligarchy. Well, since the second half of 1990s, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma was trying to install the same political regime as Putin did in Russia, when based on the oligarchs who were holding powers in most political parties, and they were ripping off the state budget from brutal and very swift privatization of the Soviet property, of all the industries that used to be the state property. What happened in Russia is that Putin won and subdued the oligarchs to his rule. And what happened in Ukraine is that no president ever succeeded in that, thankfully. So there was this competition between the oligarchs and the presidents, and we had democratic elections, but then what was on offer was not so much popular parties, but rather certain political projects that were organized. I mean, there were some certain grassroots movements, but because of this political culture, that there was no tradition of long-standing political parties, and people were very cynical towards the state. So you would have rather this empty political, like, for example, like block of Yulia Tymoshenko, the evergreen oligarch.
Lady who looks a little bit like Princess Leia from Star Wars.
She does. And it seems like she's growing younger every year. And so these political projects would be changing their names and their platforms, but basically they're just big, large business juggling.
So it'd be almost like in an Irish context, if, say, Michael O'Leary was organizing a political party against, Dermot Desmond or something like that.
Yeah, you could, yeah. Like there's this thing saying that, Ukrainian political spectrum is so diverse, parties are changing. Well, if you see through that, you see that pretty much it's about the struggles of economic interests. And of course, I mean, I'm not saying I'm all about the economy here, but the political spectrum of Ukraine is really shaped to a large degree by the oligarchs. So what happens in 2004, that when President Kuchma tried to follow the Russian steps and install his successor, Viktor Yanukovych, in the elections, so the elections were botched, and Ukrainian people, unlike our neighbors, they didn't swallow it. And I was just finishing school at that time, and there were massive protests, like first Maidan protests. Maidan means the square, means square. And you've heard Maidan Tahrir protests, and so it's the Turkic word that was adopted because Ukraine's always been close to the Turkic world. So anyway, protests were rife, and Kuchma had to go back. He was ready to crack down on Ukraine like the Russians would do. And as a school kid, I had a classmate whose father was working in security services, and he had a friend in Russian FSB, and supposedly they were in Kiev at that time, and they were ready to assist the friendly republic with crackdown, but Kuchma backed. And we had at that time the new president Viktor Yushchenko, who had been poisoned supposedly by nerve agent, but we never were able to prove that. So Viktor Yanukovych made his way to the Ukrainian power and was the president from 2010, when he was eventually elected, and into 2013, and he did try to install an authoritarian regime. And once again, the civil society were fighting back really hard. He was trying to concentrate all the wealth in the country and subjugate other powers and oligarchs and civil society to him. But what happened was that he's been flirting with Russia all along and imposing certain legislation against the constitution that Russian language would have some certain regional status in Ukraine. Also, like, he prolonged the treaty that the Russian Navy will stay in the Crimea almost indefinitely, which was basically blatant treason, but that's what he did. But he was also flirting with the EU. So when he refused to sign the EU association agreement in autumn 2014, the broad public exploded in Ukraine, and it caused the second Maidan, Euromaidan.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you there just before we get on to the 2014 Maidan revolution? So with regard to the issues involved, ostensibly it's actually about EU membership. So, Yanukovych tried to cancel discussions with the EU in favor of the president of Russia's, at the time, plan for a Eurasian Union. Why were Ukrainians, ordinary citizens, so set and so involved with this? I mean, was it a question of Ukrainian nationalism so Ukrainian speakers against Russian speakers as sometimes being presented, or was it a question of, desire for the rule of law, for more genuine democracy and that kind of thing, or both?
No, well, it was very plain, very down to earth, because, it would be very hard for anyone to understand the scale of the EU association agreement with Ukraine in terms of trade, tariffs, and all these arrangements. Like, nobody still knows what what it means, apart from experts who are working in import and export. But the one down-to-earth thing was about visa-free travel. That was one of the main benefits of this. And when Yanukovych refused to sign it, it struck chords with huge numbers of people. But what happened was that, ultimately, when he refused to sign abruptly without warning, so the negotiations were going really well and people were just waiting to apply for biometric passports so that they can travel to the EU with no restrictions. And it's hard. I think it's very hard for members of the EU to embrace what it actually means to live in a country that you need to apply visas to go everywhere. Ukraine has visa-free arrangements with many countries in the world, but the EU are our neighbors and part of this European space that we share. And so it was very painful when all of a sudden, with no explanation, with suspected pressure from Russia, Yanukovych refused to sign it. So the protests were quite small because they were restricted to people who actually know what was going on. And I wasn't even taking part in the first phase because I was very bitter about it, and I wouldn't allow myself even to accept that there was a chance that Yanukovych would have signed it. But what happened then is that around the night on the 1st December, Yanukovych decided to crack down on these very scarce protests in Maidan. And so the special forces called Berkut, this kind of eagle that is widespread in Ukraine, they cracked down on literally like students and kids who were just spending the nights in Maidan on the central square. And my best friend was there, so I woke up in the morning and I was terrified that she could have been beaten up, to half death because of that. And this, in its turn, caused massive protests across the country. It reminds me of the Easter Rising, when maybe not that many people supported the Easter Rising, but the brutal execution of the participants actually stirred such huge protests that wouldn't have been stopped. And that's what happened in 2013.
No, you could compare it to, say, the first civil rights march in Derry, where it was very badly attended, and then they were beaten up when it was shown on TV, and then there was huge protests in Derry and elsewhere. It's a little bit like that, maybe.
Yeah. So, and the protests were massive, and indeed they were in different regions. Like, people would be storming like state agencies. So this was a big protest against state brutality, and people would be forcefully disappeared and beaten and murdered by the state. So from 22nd of January 2014 into 24th of February, within a month, like almost 100 people were murdered, and they're referred to as a heavenly company, because the protesters, like the ones who were shielding the other protesters, were organizing in companies, like 100 people or so. So they were called the company, this kind of the women's company, this different kinds of companies, and this was the heavenly company. And Yanukovych fled himself at some point early 20s. I'm not sure which day. I remember really well that it was a Friday, and on Thursday, almost all these 100 people were murdered by snipers in Central Square. He fled. There were recordings of him loading his trucks with all his riches, and it was so embarrassing to watch him flee. He fled to Russia, to Rostov-na-Don, and from there he sent a communication that he's still a legitimate president, and he asked Russia to intervene.
And still claims to be the president to this day, I believe.
Oh, yes. He recently, before this invasion, before 24th of February, he's filed a claim So Ukrainian state didn't have a procedure to remove the absent president from the office because he's physically not in the country and he can't perform his functions. So they had to come up with a certain legal solution. So the Parliament of Ukraine voted to remove him from the office because he wasn't there. Supposedly, shortly before the current Russian invasion, he filed claim to one of Ukrainian administrative courts, saying that undermining the claim that decision by the parliament was illegal. And I imagine that if he won this claim after the Russian invasion, he would have been sort of reinstated by Russia as a puppet president. But in fairness, after he fled and after that decision, Ukrainian parliament called for a new presidential election and a new president was voted in. It was Petro Poroshenko, and then the new parliament was voted in later. And when I worked for a year in that parliament too.
Just to clarify though on one point, I guess you'd have to say it's a hostile narrative, but the hostile narrative of the Maidan revolution is that it was, a nationalist revolution, or they used the term a coup, and it was against the Russian speakers who they wanted to exclude from Ukraine and so on in order to join the West and so on like this.
Well, I mean, some people were indeed many people didn't support these protests. I don't want to sound like the whole its country was united. No, it drew a wedge between families and friends, and it was really a controversial issue. But it was never aimed at anything beyond Yanukovych refusing to sign the EU association agreement. And then when the crackdown started, it was about fair investigation of the crimes committed against the protesters. And there were years of police brutality that the protesters were demanding to provide remedy for, and to have reattestation of all police forces, all of that. And of course, it was about the rule of law that was really ditched by Yanukovych throughout the years. I know that there are people who will never hear me when I say that Russian speakers in Ukraine were not oppressed and that it was not about Ukraine not joining NATO. I mean, I'm really conscious of that. But if you go and look at the facts and go actually look at what, do the media analysis and ask people who were there. I was there in the protests and I wasn't taking part, throwing petrol bombs, but I was in the sort of close to the front line, and I was definitely not a Nazi.
And I know now we're getting very close to the present, and we're getting close to events which are, current and difficult for you to talk about. But basically, how did the Russian state react to events in Maidan, the fall of Viktor Yanukovych?
So the backdrop of Maidan, they started invasion of Crimea. They had a presence they were in control of the fleet of the Navy in Crimea since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a treaty between Ukraine and Russia, and there were certain rules about how they should be conducting their military activity there, the limits on personnel. But as investigations show that they were increasing their military presence quite early on, maybe even before the protests. So Russian state has issued honorary medals to the military for liberating the Crimea that predate even the referendum that they held at the gunpoint in March, I think, 2014.
But just to be clear, for people who didn't follow events at the time, so Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula in the aftermath of the Maidan events, and then in the east of Ukraine, the conflict started with Russian involvement. Let's say, I'm saying coyly. Can you basically explain what happened there?
The increased military presence of the Russian military in the Crimea, they took control of the state body in there, and the local, you could call them local parliament in there. And then afterwards they held a so-called referendum where people declared that they want to join Russia, and that was that. They went on to forcefully disappear people who were dissenting and intimidated journalists and activists, and imprisoned many, as around 130 people detained, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars detained as political prisoners from the Crimea. So over the years, I'm not sure what the figure of the enforced disappearances were as well, but they were happening early on, 2014, after Russian occupiers came in. And they've been transferring population of Russians into the occupied Crimea, which is against international humanitarian law, on the pretext of settling new military, new teachers, and new doctors from other depressed regions, so they would be giving them better salaries when they'd be moving to Crimea, which is against the international law, but sure, didn't never stop them. And what happened in the east of Ukraine? So since spring 2014, well into the summer, they started stirring up protests, like pro-Russian protests in southeast of Ukraine, like Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, and
predominantly Russian-speaking areas. We should clarify.
Yeah, you would think that they would be more Russian-speaking than the others. I wouldn't say that they were like overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. You'd hear more Russian there, yes. And what was happening that in Kharkiv and Dnipro and Zaporizhia and Odessa and even Mykolaiv and Kherson, these protests weren't successful. There would be resistance. So they would be trying to encircle the state regional administrations, and there would be response from the pro-Ukrainian protesters, and theirs would be in Odessa, it turned very ugly, and some people even died, pro-Russian people, and they're now celebrating it as some sort of massacre. And yeah, it was brutal back then. But they never succeeded in these regions. But what happened when they started doing the same in Donetsk and Luhansk after the protest, Ukrainian power was quite weak, and also Ukrainians military and the secret service were a bit endemic of Russian collaborators. So these territories didn't stand up to these kind of pseudo protests, and eventually Russia started sending in supplies and unmarked men and recruiting locals to start a sort of an insurgency. But before that, the first cities, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk in the Donbass region, were taken by the forces of this unmarked, like Russian special forces led by Girkin, who is the Russian nationalist, and he is really raging at the moment because Russia is losing the war against Ukraine. And so after Russia started bringing in weapons and recruiting locals and sending in the Russian curators, the massive military campaign started because Ukrainian army started fighting to get them out, and they took control of certain districts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And it really is infuriating that you even have to say that this was something like Russia-backed separatists, when it was the trouble that was organized by Russia in a way that would be easy to sell that this is some sort of ethnic Russians fighting for their freedom or Russian-speaking Ukrainians fighting against oppression. But I mean, I know that there are people who will never believe whatever I say in this respect, but this is, my family, my father is from Donetsk, and my family my grandfather and my aunts and my cousins had to flee, and I know that there were no history of any Donbass separatism up till then.
As you said, I mean, even in the online world, let's say people are very attached to their narratives, even if they're not, connected by birth or by family or anything to the region. And what do you think has been the long-term Russian goal in Ukraine since 2014? What are they trying to achieve with the various actions that they've taken?
With the war of 2014, I think that they were being very opportunistic. Like they're trying to see what works. So they declare that this is in 2014. They call this Russian Spring and reinstatement of Novorossiya, this southeast of Ukraine. That was colonized by Catherine II. They try to liberate the Novorossiya as a breakaway region, basically partition Ukraine, take half of Ukraine under their control.
Sorry to jump in, Nadia, but like with the goal of kind of making Ukraine into a protectorate, as the British Empire used to say, that kind of thing. So it'd be nominally self-governing, but really part of Russia. Is that the goal?
No. My sense is that what they would have done would be initially an independent, like a breakaway state. Like that's what they did were trying to do to Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. Like they wouldn't annexate them as they did to Crimea. They would have this unrecognized, like gray zone, like Transnistria or Abkhazia or South Ossetia in Georgia that they took over. So this would have impeded any Ukrainian alliances with the EU and NATO. And I think that would have been their ultimate goal.
So it is kind of about, though, having, like in Belarus, for example, has its own president, but he very much seems to be under the orders of the president of Russia. Was that the kind of goal in Ukraine?
I mean, I think that, that's my hot take, that when they pressed Yanukovych I'm 100% sure that he refused to sign the EU association agreement. because of the Russian pressure. And I think that they realize that this is the moment when Ukraine will just break away indefinitely from the Russian world, from this closer relations with the EU, association with the EU could be a step towards EU membership, potentially. So, and this would have meant that Russia wouldn't be able to have a friendly, like Belarus, like Ukraine, their sphere of interests. And I'm definitely sure that it was not so much about their security or anything. It was about their control. And they've set up this as an alternative to the EU, so-called customs union, and they were really urging Ukraine to join it, and Yanukovych would be kind of flickering and not agreeing to it. But basically Ukrainians saw that if we are giving up on the EU, we'll be dragged into this customs union and basically be part of the Russian Empire again. And this was definitely not in the best interest of Ukraine, as we can see now, because basically it means that Russians will wipe out our identity, as what they're doing now as we're speaking, like burning Ukrainian books, occupied Melitopol, bringing in Russian curriculums and books into occupied schools. And that's what they were doing in the Russian after they occupied Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014.
And the president of Russia, just before this war, he wrote, or had written for him perhaps, a very lengthy essay, and then he had a long speech on TV where he enunciated his opinion that Ukraine was not actually a country and so on, and that was really a part of Russia, and people in Ukraine were mistaken in their belief that it was a country. So, it does appear that the goal is very much to bring Ukraine back into Russian orbit, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I saw that article, like I felt that, the war is imminent, like comprehensive war, you know what I mean? I mean, this whole narrative about Ukraine not being a nation, being just delusional little Russians, it's been present cherished in Russian Empire since the 19th century. So it's nothing new. So it's just that now it's been proclaimed on the world wide scale and everybody can hear it, but this is what has been Russian narratives and official state ideology since Russia embraced themselves as an empire.
I mean, there's a great quote from Ernst Renan, who was a 19th century French philosopher, and he said, "A nation is a plebiscite of every day." So in other words, it's about the desire of the people to live together, whether or not they qualify in some sort of, non-existent objective terms. But I mean, I hope we've shown today, Nadia, that Ukraine is, a historical nation and has existed for a long time and has its own rich history. So thank you very much, Nadia, for joining me today. And I hope you've enjoyed talking to us.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
So that was John Dorney and Nadia Dobrianska discussing the parallels between Ukrainian history and Ireland. So you can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, and you can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod, or on Facebook, facebook.com, The Irish History Show. So until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.